Fake Tanks of War Thunder Episode 2. In this video, we'll take a look at some more tanks with dubious histories and fictional implementations. In late 1944, the German army was facing heavier armor in both the western and eastern fronts. Tanks like the IS-2 proved to be worthy opponents to the Tigers and Panthers, and so the solution was to add more armor and bigger guns. The Tiger II was already seeing combat by that point, and its 88mm Kampfwagenkanone 43 was highly effective, being able to frontally penetrate most enemy tanks. The cannon was designed by Krupp, who had been developing these weapons since the mid-19th century. In classic Wunderwaffe fashion though, Krupp was not satisfied with the 88mm and proposed a new 105mm cannon to be mounted on the Tiger II. The company came up with a rough sketch and presented it to the German army. Officials took a look at the drawings and noticed some of the obvious flaws. For starters, the turret of the Tiger II was cramped enough already. The 88mm breech severely limited the space in the fighting compartment, so mounting something even bigger was out of the question. Even if they did manage to fit the gun, the ammunition it used would have been another issue. Because the caliber was so large, the projectile and the propellant would need to be loaded separately, which would have required an extra loader. Like I said though, there was barely enough room for the existing crew members, so the new cannon would have been borderline impossible to operate. Ignoring that, Germany's resources were stretched thin by that point in the war, and introducing a new design would have disrupted an already fragile production line. The 88mm was already more than capable of dealing with anything it faced at long range, making the 105 completely overkill for no real gain. Not even a prototype was built, and so the only evidence behind the Tiger 105 are the sketches by Krupp. So why is it in the game? Well, just like the Panther II, it was added all the way back in the closed beta testing for ground forces in 2014. According to the devs, it was meant to be a counterpart to the Soviet IS-4 at the time. After more vehicles were added though, the IS-4 had plenty of counters, and so the Tiger II 105 was removed from the game in 2019. While it's not as bad as the Ho-Ri in terms of authenticity, the only thing proving its existence are a couple of sketches, making it a completely paper vehicle. Realism rank F. After seeing India modernize their tank fleet with T-72s in the 70s and 80s, Pakistan decided to begin a domestic tank program of their own. By that point, their arsenal consisted of aging Type 59 and 69 tanks from China, which were no match against the T-72. As a result, Pakistan and China began designing what would later become the Al-Khalid. The project officially began in 1988, and the first couple of prototypes were built in the early 90s. However, it became apparent that the tank was still years away from entering production, so the Pakistani government started looking for a stopgap during that period. A couple of tanks were considered, including the M1 Abrams, but none of these offered the combination of cost, performance, and capability that Pakistan was looking for. Now, as all of this was going on, the Soviet Union collapsed, leading to the independence of several countries. One of such nations was Ukraine, which also inherited a large tank industry. The new Ukrainian government urgently needed export revenue, and so they began putting their tanks on the market. This was the perfect opportunity for both countries. Despite Russian attempts to block the deal, Pakistan signed the purchase of 320 T-80UDs. By the early 2000s, the Pakistani tank fleet was supplemented with these new modern imports, and the Al-Khalid had entered mass production. About a decade later in the 2010s, Pakistan started looking for a next-generation tank to make sure their military had cutting-edge technology in what became known as the Haider Main Battle Tank program. The two main contenders were the Chinese VT-4 and the Ukrainian T-84 Oplot-M. Both tanks proved to be capable enough, but Pakistan ordered a special Oplot-p variant to meet their requirements. Ultimately though, the VT-4 was chosen instead, partly due to Ukraine's trouble with its exports to Thailand. The Thai army had also ordered a number of Oplot-T variants, but the program suffered years of production production delays due to internal and external problems in Ukraine. Pakistan chose the more reliable deal and signed off on the VT-4. Now with all that in mind, let's get back to War Thunder. The tank we have in the game is the Oplot-M. If you paid attention, you'd notice two problems here. Number one, Pakistan never operated the T-84 in the first place. They did use the T-80UD, which is also in the Chinese tree, but the Oplot was only tested and eventually rejected. Number two, if Pakistan were to use the tank, it would have been the P variant and not the M, which is a copy-paste of the Oplot-T. That being said, there is an argument to be made about which tank got delivered for testing. There's documented evidence of the M being evaluated, but I couldn't find anything that indicates the P ever being tested in Pakistan itself. This is also what Smin claimed in the forums. So the M variants being in the game makes more sense, but still, adding the tank to the tree just because it was tested is a bit misleading, especially considering the Thai VT-4 fiasco. Realism rank C. Unlike a lot of the other vehicles in the game, this one was a private venture instead of a national contract. It was a collaboration between two companies, Hägglunds from Sweden, who manufactured the CV90's hull, and Giat from France, who built the turret. The CV90 was designed in the mid-1980s to be a flexible and versatile hull, capable of mounting different turrets if needed. The TML, or the Light Modular Turret in English, was also built to be a modular platform that could be mounted on several hulls. In 1993, the two companies behind these designs realized the potential of a collaboration and developed the CV90-105 TML in a joint private venture. The vehicle was unveiled at the Eurosatory Defense Exhibition in 1994 after completing its trials. Unfortunately for both companies though, no countries placed any orders. This was due to a number of reasons. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War led to a massive decrease in military spending worldwide, and there were suddenly lots of MBTs for sale at a cheap price. The market was saturated with these vehicles, and the doctrines at the time still favored armored MBTs instead of light and mobile AFVs. The vehicle was ahead of its time, but it was unveiled at the worst possible moment, and so the project was stopped after a single prototype. The two companies went their separate ways, and their respective products continued development. Notably, the TML turret got several upgrades in 1997, including a stabilizer, autoloader, and a commander's periscope, which contained thermals. Why do I mention this? In the Viking Fury update, the vehicle was released as a premium in the Swedish tech tree. It included a lot more than what it had in 1994, including, you guessed it, a two-plane stabilizer, an autoloader, and commander thermals. Like I said though, these additions were only implemented after the project had been called off, and this upgraded turret was never mounted on the CV90. 2.5 years later, with the Drone Age update in 2022, Gaijin finally acknowledged that the vehicle was unrealistic and replaced it entirely with a brand new tank, the CV90-105 XC8, which is now called the CV90-105. People who bought the TML would get this replacement, and they'd keep their camouflages and other premium benefits. This variant was similar to the previous, but with the turret designed by a different company, namely CMI Defense, known today as John Cockerill. This new design featured a stabilizer, autoloader, thermals, and was overall a much better vehicle than its predecessor. However, with the Task Force update in 2025, the TML returned as a researchable vehicle, but this time without any of the anachronistic upgrades. While the devs did correct their mistake eventually, the fictional CV90-105 TML was in the game for more than 2 years, which earns it a spot in this video. Also, fun fact, despite being renamed to the CV90-105, it's still called the XC8 on the War Thunder store. Anyway, realism rank C. In the late stages of World War II, Germany could not keep up with Allied aircraft production and basically abandoned the idea of air supremacy. Instead, they shifted focus towards land-based anti-air solutions. While flak cannons could defend factories and such, German divisions on the front lines needed mobile weapon platforms. Anti-air half-tracks and towed cannons were used extensively, but these were highly vulnerable as they could be taken out by small arms fire, shrapnel, artillery, and more. War. The solution was to build a self-propelled anti-air platform that protected the crew in case it was attacked, a so-called Flakpanzer, if you will. This line of thinking led to the creation of the Whirlwind and Ostwind, built on the chassis of the Panzer IV. These were decently effective, but were both open-top vehicles, still vulnerable to aerial attacks. In mid-1943, Rheinmetall designed an SPAA using the Panther chassis, featuring excellent protection and a quad 20mm cannon setup. However, the 20mm guns were deemed to be inadequate by that point, and so a new requirement of two 37mm cannons was put forth. A few months later, the Flakpanzer 341 was designed, and a wooden mock-up of the turret was mounted on a Panther chassis. Development continued until 1945, but once again, the 37mm cannons were considered to be insufficient. The new requirement was two 55mm cannons, but this was pretty much a pipe dream as the war ended a few months later. As far as we know, there were no prototypes of the Coelian, and the design only made it as far as the wooden mock-up turret. It was added to the game alongside the Wirbelwind, Ostwind, and Kugelblitz back in 2014. Back then, it was the highest ranking SPAA of the German tree. However, 5 years later in 2019, it was removed from the tree due to the aforementioned reasons. If I'm being honest, the Coelian was the perfect anti-air for the old German 6.7 lineup with high-velocity guns and decent protection, but I can see why it was removed. Realism rank? D. In the same update as the Coelian's removal, Gaijin introduced its replacement, the Ostwind II. Development of this vehicle follows a similar story. Before the Ostwind had entered production, the dual 37mm cannon requirements for new SPAAs was put forth by Hitler. Ostbau Works, the same plant which produced the original Ostwind, got to work on a new design following this demand. Ostbau was not a large manufacturer like Krupp or Rheinmetall. They were mainly specialized in converting and repurposing existing vehicles. And since Germany was not exactly swimming in resources by 1944, the plant decided to use the Panzer IV chassis instead of the Panthers. Ultimately though, the project was disrupted and eventually stopped due to how the war ended up. That being said, a single prototype was completed in 1945, is what I would say if we had any proof. No photographs exist of this so-called prototype, and documentation regarding its development is very limited, especially from primary sources. According to some historians, the prototype was completed with a potential 100 more vehicles being ordered. Others say that the prototype did exist, but the turret was only for testing purposes and could not actually work. And according to some, the turret design was not even possible as the extra cannon would not fit inside the cramped Ostwind turret. Regardless, there's little to no documentation that proves the existence of the prototype, and the project itself has a questionable history. Not only that, but they also released a premium Ostwind Ost with a camouflage net and Ostkitten in the two fronts pack. Supposedly, the vehicles in this pack were inspired by tanks on the western and eastern fronts, which is even more unrealistic, seeing as the Ostwind II likely didn't see combat. The fact that Gaijin replaced the mock-up Coelian with a vehicle that might have had a prototype is also an interesting choice for sure. Realism rank? D. When the Second World War kicked off in September 1939, the British government assembled a team of veteran engineers from World War I, known as the Old Gang. They had designed some of the first tanks in the Great War, and their task this time was to develop a heavy breakthrough tank. Many British generals and theorists assumed that the war would devolve into trench warfare like it did in 1914. And so, the design of the TOG, or the Old Gang tank, was extremely long, built to cross trenches. The team's first design, called the TOG-1, had a smaller cannon, exposed tracks, and a very primitive transmission and suspension system. The design was finished in 1940, and a single prototype was built in September of the same year. To the dismay of everyone involved, World War II doctrines were completely different than what they expected. Instead of trench warfare, the German blitzkrieg strategy made the TOG obsolete before it was even finished. So when France capitulated in 1940, the British were left with a massive project that was outdated for the changing landscape of warfare. Other, more practical designs like the Churchill series took over the breakthrough role and the old gang had to adapt. Instead of scrapping the project, the team developed it further into the Kw.K with improved mobility, the much better 28-pounder gun, and thicker armor. Like the original, only a single prototype was built and the first trials began in March of 1941. This prototype was only a test vehicle at first with incomplete features and a mock-up turret. As time went on though, more and more of its features were added and the final version was finished around 1943 called the Kw.K Star. Despite all these modernizations, the project was eventually cancelled in 1944 since other existing tanks perform much better in the role it was built for. The only Kw.K Star prototype is currently displayed at the Tank Museum in Bovington. The implementation of the tank in War Thunder is the final prototype variant with all the bells and whistles of the Star. However, the vehicle has a modification called the GWP or the Great War Pattern. Equipping this modification adds 2 sponsons to the tank and a hull-mounted howitzer. In real life, when the first designs were being created, the World War I style thinking led to these extra armaments with even a wooden mock-up including them. However, as time went on, the old gang realized that these were impractical and dropped them before the prototype was complete in favor of other modifications. The Star variants never had them, and the final proposed Kw.K model didn't include them in its designs either. As a result, the tank we have in the game is realistic, but with a GWP modification, it becomes a mismatch of early and finalized prototype designs. In the dev blog, the developers state that this variant was one of its intended final forms, but like I said, the idea of sponsons and the extra howitzer was dropped pretty early on. I will give Gaijin some credit though, the extra stuff is only a modification and you can turn them off if you really want to. To be honest, I think the GWP really adds to the whole Great War aesthetic of the vehicle, though I wish the sponson machine guns were actually usable. Realism rank? B. And that about wraps it up for this video. Once again, special thanks to the Human Oddity for their list on Reddit, and also thank you to the previous commenters for their suggestions. Depending on the reception, I might consider a part 3, so let me know what you think. All of my sources are in the description, and if you have anything you'd like to add, leave a comment. Other than that, thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next video.